G'day people, I'm Sharyn, welcome to my channel. Have you ever stopped to think just what stitch length is the right length to use for your projects? Let's have a little look today. A really short stitch length will be hard to unpick. When might that be appropriate? If there's any time you're doing a seam and it's not appropriate to do a lock stitch at the beginning, shorten your stitch down very tiny and do about 1 centimetre or 1/2 inch of very, very short stitches, and then go out to the size of stitch you actually want to use until you're at the last 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre of the seam. That way it works as a lock off at the ends. But remember, it's hard to undo. Not only is it hard to undo, it's also very time consuming to sew. You really don't need to use a very short stitch length on straight stitch very often at all. Setting your machine to the longest stitch length will provide something that is going to be really easy to undo. You only need to clip along about every 3rd stitch with your stitch ripper and it will easily pull out. That's the stuff you need to do for basting. It's also the kind of thing you need to do for gathering. The default stitch length on most of our machines is going to be 2.4-ish. That's not a bad stitch length, but it's also not a necessary one. You can probably stretch that out a bit further, maybe up to 2.8, and you'll still get a perfectly good seam, but it will be a little bit easier to unpick. If you're using a twin needle to try to emulate a cover stitch machine, which is the hems we get on t-shirts and things like that, do a long stitch. I'm talking 3.5 to 4. If you have a look at those hems on industrially made garments, the stitch is actually quite long. And one of the things we do when we put a shorter stitch in is we make it look homemade. Top stitching on industrially made garments is usually quite a long stitch as well. 3.5 to 4. It works because that's the way we expect to see things on commercially produced garments. And yes, I did have 2 pieces of thread going through the needle at once. That makes it look more like a top stitching thread. From the right we have a very short stitch, a very long stitch, the default stitch for the machine, a twin needle set at 4 mils, and a top stitch, 4 mils with 2 threads through the needle. If you're trying to do something that looks like the felled seam on a pair of jeans, have a close look at a pair of jeans before you do it. They are also long stitches, probably 3.5 to 4 is what you need to have your machine set to. The default setting on our machine is really quite a short stitch compared to what is usually used in industry. If you're sewing on a fabric that's got a fluffy back on it, then while your machine's trying to sew, the feed dogs are essentially trying to grab hold of fairy floss. It's hard for them to move the fabric along. So the bigger you've got your stitch, the more normal it will come out, and that applies to overlockers as well as sewing machines. The thicker the fabric that you are sewing, the more of the length of the stitch that will get taken up in that depth of fabric. So thick fabric, you need to increase your stitch length. When it comes right down to it, I rarely ever use the default setting on my machine for stitch length. It's just too short. Think about what you're sewing. Have a look at the commercial garments that you're comparing it to. You'll probably want to increase your stitch length most of the time. I hope you've heard something today that may change your ideas about how to set your stitch length while you're sewing. See you next time.